Hey friends, this is a video about how to make friends as an adult, and it's based on a couple of experiences that I've had in forming deep connections with people um, outside of traditional environments like school or work even. And I wanted to dig into some of the aspects that came up in those contexts that I think shed some light onto some of the conditions required to make deep, lasting relationships. So I'm thinking in particular about a couple of things. So one is my Alexander Technique teacher training, and another is the coaching training that I went on. Both of these were outside of work activities, yet they led to surprisingly deep relationships, and many people in both groups are now good friends. So I want to kind of dig into what is it about those settings that facilitated friendships to emerge. I think there are three things. The first is having regular repeated contact. So you can't make a new friend in a one-off meeting, or you can meet someone and think they're cool, but that doesn't mean they'll be your friend easily. You kind of have to keep touching in over time, have kind of some kind of a shared, oh yeah, I met you last time kind of energy. And so a training environment is really good for that, because for Alexander Technique, I would meet people, the same group, every month at the weekend and regularly after work in the evening sessions as well. Same with the coaching, but on a shorter time frame. We had five long weekends for five weeks basically, so one weekend a month, and that would again give us the chance to check in and say, oh, you were here last time. How's it going? How are things going? This kind of repeated, regular structure is really helpful to allow things to deepen and unfold over time. The second one is some kind of common purpose. So by this, I mean some kind of semi-structured environment where there's a reason that you're there together. Where you're learning something, you want to explore something new together, and you can talk about this with each other. So it's not just a networking event where the purpose is to meet people. You're actually going there for a reason, and whenever you need to, and I'll come onto this in a minute, you can always default back to that thing. And one of the great things again about training environments is that everyone is in some way a beginner, or they're all there explicitly to learn, and that should take down some element of natural defensiveness or egotism that can often get in the way of forming deeper relationships. Now, the reason I mentioned the purpose, the structure, is for number three, which is having conditions to facilitate depth and vulnerability. So you can have regular meetings with people over a long period of time in a kind of a purposeful way, without ever really going to those places with them that moves you from acquaintance or someone you see at the pub to a friend, someone you'd phone up at night if you had an emergency. Very different thing. And vulnerability is something that you can encourage. So again, the kind of training environments that I'm talking about here around Alexander Technique and coaching, they both take you to a place where you don't know exactly what's going on. You're probably exposing aspects of yourself that aren't always visible to other people. It's very, it can be quite disorienting in that way, but in a safe and well-designed structure. So the group is going through an experience together, and you're going through that experience with the group, and it's that connection that I think is really important there. And if you take out any one of these elements, if you have one big transformation experience with vulnerability, with a purpose, but it only happens once, then it was a nice experience where you had a deep experience, but you didn't really form lasting connection. If you don't have the structure, the purpose of why you're there together, so it's a kind of a repeated vulnerability, that feels to me more like a kind of, you're going there to make friends, you're going there to be vulnerable, and that feels a little bit contrived, or at least uncomfortable. Some might disagree with this, but I think having some kind of, I'm here to learn X, or now we're doing this exercise. How did you experience what we just did before? What was, what have you learned from that? These kinds of things that you can fall back on in terms of, yes, we're all here doing a thing, and it's not that weird, right? Really helps to reduce that discomfort that might get in the way of even going to these things or making friends. And then lastly, as I said already, the absence of a vulnerable space means that you can get to know people superficially, and you won't really become friends with that. You'll know each other, but you won't go deep. So those, I think, are the three big things that have contributed to me making friends as an adult in these two domains. And also, a lot of my friends come from work. You kind of get this when you have repeated interactions, you're there for a reason, and sometimes you can get that vulnerability. Perhaps if you're working very hard, you find someone who is on the same wavelength as you, whatever it might be, that you kind of you open up over time, and then you get friendship. I'm really interested as well in how this applies to Twitter, because I see very similar things happening there. You have those three elements, at least in some parts. You have a place where people go regularly, and you see the same names, the same faces or avatars repeatedly over potentially long periods of time, and you have lots of little interactions. They could be very light touch, just a reply here or like there, whatever, but you get to know each other as a community. It's hard to pin down exactly, but there is also a kind of purpose. I mean, we're there to explore our curiosities, we're there to, entertain ourselves, we're there to absorb a kind of a vibe. There is a culture there that you can participate in, and that culture is itself a kind of thing that you're there for, that you can fall back on. I think this is also the value of memes, of in-jokes, of all those little things that you can kind of fall back on as something that we're here to do, that kind of can take a step back from any vulnerability or anything else. If it gets a bit too much, you just make a joke, or you can reference something else that's happened. It's a great diffusing technique. And then finally, it might just be this part of Twitter, but you can go really deep with people. You can be very vulnerable, particularly the avatar accounts where they're there to be vulnerable and people encourage it with each other to facilitate vulnerability. It's a kind of a digital space where not only is that allowed, but it's encouraged. As long as everyone is kind, they are open and warm towards people. There's a kind of a culture there. You can go pretty deep with people, and I just love that these conditions that I've experienced in those training environments that have led to a lot of deep friends, I'm seeing replicated quite well in Twitter, and I'm making a lot of friends on Twitter by doing this. I haven't met a lot of them yet. I'm convinced that I will meet many. I've met some, but already, like, I've had more than 50 Zoom calls now, I think, with people from around the world via Twitter, and immediately within a couple of minutes we are talking to each other as if we've known each other for months, which in many cases we have, but we're already going in a kind of nearer to friend level than someone who I'm just meeting off the street, or even some of my other friends. We're talking about things more quickly than I've experienced elsewhere. So I just think that's really cool. I wanted to share that with you. And if you have any thoughts on whether you agree or disagree with any other conditions, or if you think you don't need any of these, then please let me know in the comments. Thanks.